What does it mean when a civilization leaves behind a question instead of an answer? History is often presented as a clean procession, one discovery leading neatly to the next, each century handing its tools to the one that follows. But the deeper we look, the less orderly that story becomes. In museums, monasteries, desert archives, and ruined libraries, there are texts that do not sit comfortably in the timeline assigned to them. They seem to arrive from the past carrying ideas that feel strangely premature, as if someone somewhere once saw farther than we believe possible. Some of these manuscripts speak in symbols no scholar can fully read. Others survive only in fragments, copies, or translations shadowed by doubt. Yet together they share a certain mood. They are not merely old, they feel out of place. Their pages hold images of stars mapped with unsettling confidence, matter described in language that sounds almost modern, bodies rendered with an intimacy that should have belonged to a later age. Whether these details are misunderstood, exaggerated, symbolic, or genuinely extraordinary is precisely the point. They endure because they refuse to become simple. And maybe that is why they continue to haunt us. Not because they prove that the ancient world possessed secret machines or impossible sciences, but because they expose how fragile our confidence can be. We like to think knowledge moves forward in a straight line. These texts suggest a more human pattern. Insight appearing, vanishing, returning in altered form, wisdom preserved in one place, forgotten in another, truth mixed with imagination until the two can no longer be separated. This is not a journey into certainty. It is a journey into the borderland between record and interpretation, invention and memory. Across 10 ancient texts, we will follow that uneasy trail and ask a quiet but enduring question. When the past seems to know too much, are we looking at lost knowledge, symbolic brilliance, or the limits of our own understanding? What if the oldest machines were first imagined not in metal but in words? Picture a candlelit room in ancient Alexandria, or perhaps in another city whose name has been softened by time. A scholar bends over a manuscript, recording principles of motion, pressure, and balance with the patience of someone listening to the hidden logic of the world. Outside, empires trade grain, glass, and rumor. Inside, ideas are being assembled that sound uncannily like the early language of engineering. Among the most intriguing ancient writings are those attributed to inventors and mechanicians who treated air, water, and steam not as mysteries to worship, but as forces to study. In their pages, one finds descriptions of self-opening temple doors, automated devices, clever pumps, and spheres that spun when heated vapor escaped through narrow outlets. These were not industrial engines in the modern sense. They were demonstrations, experiments, and acts of wonder. Yet they reveal something easy to forget. The desire to harness nature is far older than the factories that would later define it. What makes these texts so arresting is not simply that they describe working mechanisms. It is the mindset behind them. They suggest a world in which observation, mathematics, ritual, and performance could exist together. A machine might serve practical needs, but it might also create awe, transforming a sanctuary into a theater of invisible forces. In that union of utility and spectacle, we glimpse an early understanding that technology is never only about function. It is also about meaning, trust, and the stories people tell around power. Of course, it is tempting to look back and call these devices prototypes of a future that failed to arrive. But history is rarely a tale of missed destiny. Knowledge appears where conditions allow it, and it disappears when those conditions change. What survived in parchment may not have survived in practice. What was demonstrated in one generation may have become a curiosity in the next. And so the question lingers. When ancient texts describe mechanisms ahead of their time, are we seeing the birth of modern engineering? Or a reminder that human ingenuity has always flickered long before history was ready to keep the flame alive? How much can a picture know before we decide it knows too much? Imagine a sheet of weathered parchment spread across a wooden table. Its surface is crowded with delicate lines, circles, and notes written by a careful hand. At first glance, it seems like a work of devotion or curiosity, the kind of object made by someone trying to bring order to an overwhelming sky. But the longer one looks, the more unsettling it becomes. The heaven appear not as scattered myth, but as a structure, measured, repeatable, almost intimate. Some of the most striking ancient texts and diagrams do not announce themselves as revolutionary. They whisper instead. A star chart here, a planetary table there, a method for predicting celestial motion that feels far too disciplined for the age we imagine around it. These documents remind us that ancient astronomy was never merely about wonder. It was about orientation, survival, ritual, and the deep human need to find pattern in darkness. To modernize what feels astonishing is often the precision. Observers working without telescopes still tracked cycles, mapped eclipses, and noticed the slow drift of celestial bodies with extraordinary care. Their instruments were simple by our standards, but their patience was immense. Night after night, generation after generation, they built knowledge the slow way, through repetition, memory, and the faith that the sky could be read. In some cases, their conclusions seemed so advanced that later centuries would treat them all almost as anomalies. But perhaps that reaction says as much about us as it does about them. We are often surprised when intelligence appears outside our preferred narrative of progress. We imagine the past as dimly lit, and then we encounter people who had already learned to think statistically, geometrically, symbolically. People who could transform the movement of the heavens into durable systems of meaning. Their language may differ from ours, but their ambition does not. The real mystery may not be whether these texts contain knowledge ahead of their time. It may be why we so often underestimate the minds that produce them. When an ancient manuscript looks modern, perhaps it is not the past that feels misplaced. Perhaps it is our own certainty about who gets to be called advanced. What if the human body was understood long before the modern world learned how to describe that understanding? In a quiet chamber lined with reed pens, pigments, and folded scrolls, a healer writes down what hands have already learned. The body is not an abstraction here. It is weight, pulse, fracture, fever, breath. It is the place where suffering becomes knowledge. Across some of the oldest medical texts, there is a tone that feels startlingly familiar. Careful, observational, practical, less prophecy than procedure, less magic than method. Even when the two still live side by side, ancient medical manuscripts often reveal a world paying closer attention than we expect. They describe wounds, organs, symptoms, and treatments with a precision born not from theory alone, but from repeated human encounter. A broken bone had to be set. A swollen limb had to be judged. A failing heartbeat had to be noticed before language for circulation or infection fully existed. These texts do not read like modern medicine, but they show an early discipline of listening to the body rather than merely speaking over it. That is what gives them their quiet power. They suggest that science does not begin when modern terminology appears. It begins whenever someone resists superstition long enough to observe carefully, compare honestly, and record what happens next. In some ancient traditions, that process led to remarkably detailed anatomical awareness. In others, it produced systems of balance and diagnosis that blended empirical insight with cosmology. Not all of it was correct, but not all of it was guesswork either. To read such texts now is to feel a strange intimacy across time. The names of diseases change, the instruments improve, yet the central drama remains constant, a human being in pain and another trying to help. That effort, repeated over centuries, becomes a kind of inheritance, fragile, imperfect, deeply humane. So when ancient writings seem ahead of their time, perhaps what we are really encountering is not lost modernity, but something more moving, the long continuity of care. The body has always been a mystery, but it has never stopped teaching those willing to watch, to touch, and to remember. Can a page become a machine for memory? Some ancient texts do more than preserve ideas. They organize them with such elegance that the page itself begins to feel like an instrument. Imagine a scholar tracing columns, diagrams, ratios, and repeating symbols by lamplight. Not simply writing down knowledge, but arranging it so the mind can return to it, test it, and carry it forward. In those moments, the manuscript becomes more than a record. It becomes a tool. This is especially striking in writings devoted to mathematics, measurement, and calculation. Long before the language of modern computation, there were texts that broke complex problems into repeatable steps. They taught readers how to divide land, estimate volume, track commercial exchange, and model relationships between numbers with a clarity that still feels surprisingly fresh. Their genius was not speed, but structure. They offered a way to think reliably, even across distance and time. That may be one of the most overlooked technologies in human history: procedure. A civilization does not need silicon to create something algorithmic. It only needs a method that can be followed, checked, and taught. In ancient mathematical writings, we often see exactly that. Step by step, line by line, the text guides the reader through operations that transform uncertainty into order. These were not machines made of gears or steam. They were cognitive engines extending the reach of the human mind. And yet there is something humbling in this realization. We often celebrate invention when it becomes visible in metal, glass, or electricity. But many of the deepest innovations begin invisibly, as patterns of thought disciplined into form. A table, a formula, a set of instructions copied across generations. These too alter the future. They train attention. They reduce error. They allow one person's insight to become another person's starting point. So perhaps the wonder in these ancient texts is not that they anticipated modern technology in a literal sense. It is that they reveal how technology begins long before machines. It begins when thought itself is shaped into something durable, something another mind can enter, use, and trust. In that sense, every careful manuscript is also a quiet invention, and every reader becomes part of the mechanism. What do we really see when an ancient text describes the world in pieces too small for the eye? There is a particular kind of wonder that begins not with the sky or the sea, but with dust. A thinker sits in the dry heat of the old world, surrounded not by instruments, but by questions. He watches things break, burn, dissolve, and vanish. He notices how wood becomes ash, how scent travels through air, how stone can be worn smooth by time. And from those ordinary transformations comes an idea both simple and radical. Perhaps everything visible is made from things too small to see. In some ancient philosophical texts, matter is imagined as composed of indivisible units, moving through emptiness, combining and separating according to hidden patterns. The language is speculative, often poetic, and far from the rigor of modern physics. Yet the conceptual leap remains extraordinary. These writers were trying to explain permanence and change without relying only on myth. They asked how the world could appear stable while constantly shifting, and how complexity could arise from unseen simplicity. It is tempting to read those passages as evidence that ancient thinkers had somehow anticipated the atom in a modern scientific sense. That would be too easy and not entirely fair. Their ideas were not built from laboratory proof. They emerged from reasoning, analogy, and a disciplined willingness to imagine structures beneath appearances. Still, the resemblance is haunting. Across centuries, their questions echo into later science, not because they solved the problem, but because they framed it in a way that endured. This is where the boundary between foresight and interpretation becomes delicate. We often search the past for confirmation of the present, as if earlier minds matter most when they resemble us. But perhaps their real gift lies elsewhere. They remind us that human understanding begins in acts of imagination that are both fragile and bold. Before knowledge can be tested, it must first be conceived. Before a truth can be measured, someone has to suspect it exists. So when ancient texts seem to reach toward modern ideas of matter, the deeper story may not be about prediction at all. It may be about intellectual courage, the quiet willingness to believe that reality extends beyond what the senses can hold, and that the invisible, though uncertain, is still worth thinking about. What survives when the original is gone and only the echo remains? Many of the most intriguing ancient texts do not come to us intact. They arrive as fragments quoted by later writers, as copies of copies, as translations shaped by another language in another age. A page disappears in fire, war, weather, or neglect, and yet something persists, a sentence, a diagram, a rumor of an idea. In that fragile chain of survival, knowledge becomes less like a monument and more like a whisper carried across centuries. This matters because some texts seem advanced not only for what they say, but for how narrowly they escape being lost altogether. A mathematical principle, a medical observation, a mechanical concept, a map of the heavens. Often what we possess is incomplete. Missing sections create openings into which imagination naturally flows. Scholars work carefully to separate what was likely written from what was later added, misunderstood, or idealized. But uncertainty remains part of the experience. These are not clean inheritances. They are damaged transmissions. And yet there is something moving in that damage. It reminds us that civilization is never guaranteed to remember its best ideas. We like to imagine progress as accumulation, as if, once discovered, knowledge simply stays discovered. The historical record says otherwise. Libraries vanish, empires collapse, languages die. Techniques once mastered can slip into obscurity until a later generation rediscovers them and believes for a moment that it is seeing something entirely new. That is why ancient texts sometimes feel ahead of their time, not always because they belong to a lost golden age, but because time itself is uneven. Insight does not travel in a straight line. It advances, stalls, disappears, and returns wearing a different name. What one culture preserves, another may overlook. What one century treats as curiosity, another may recognize as profound. So perhaps the real mystery is not how ancient people knew certain things. It is how often humanity forgets what it once knew. Every surviving fragment stands against that forgetting. Every damaged manuscript becomes evidence of a larger truth. Memory is one of civilization's most delicate technologies, and once broken, it can take centuries to repair. Why do some manuscripts feel less like books and more like encounters? There are texts that inform, and then there are texts that unsettle. You open them expecting history and instead find something closer to a threshold. Unfamiliar diagrams bloom across the page. Plants resemble anatomy. Machines resemble prayer. The language, when it can be read at all, seems to move between observation and dream. These works endure not because they are fully understood, but because they resist being reduced to one meaning. Among the most famous examples are manuscripts whose contents remain partially undeciphered or endlessly debated. Their mystery has invited speculation of every kind, from the disciplined to the extravagant. But stripped of fantasy, what remains is still remarkable. Here are documents in which knowledge was gathered not according to the categories we now prefer, but according to older habits of mind, where medicine, cosmology, craft, symbolism, and spiritual order might all inhabit the same page without contradiction. To modern readers, that blending can make a text appear strangely advanced or strangely alien. We are trained to separate fields, to place astronomy in one room, healing in another, engineering somewhere else. Ancient and medieval thinkers were often less strict. They were trying to understand a world they experienced as interconnected. The body mirrored the landscape. The heavens influenced the calendar. Matter, motion, health, and meaning belong to one fabric. A manuscript reflecting that worldview may look obscure to us not because it lacks intelligence, but because its intelligence is woven differently. That difference is worth lingering over. Not every unreadable text contains hidden technology. Not every mysterious diagram points to forgotten science. Sometimes the unfamiliar is simply unfamiliar. Yet even then, such works teach us something essential. They reveal how much of interpretation depends on our own habits of seeing. We do not merely recover the past, we negotiate with it, bringing our questions to pages shaped by other minds and other fears. So when a manuscript refuses to yield its full meaning, perhaps the lesson is not frustration, but humility. Some forms of knowledge are not lost because they were secret. They are lost because the world that once made them legible has changed, and we are left standing at its edge, reading by partial light. What happens when a civilization learns to read the earth as if it were a text? Long before satellites, long before modern geology, there were observers who watched rivers shift, stones fracture, coastlines erode, and seasons carve their signatures into the land. Their writings do not always sound scientific in the contemporary sense, yet they often reveal a disciplined intimacy with the material world. Mountains were not just sacred silhouettes. They were records of pressure, time, and transformation. The earth was speaking, and some ancient minds were learning how to listen. In several old texts, natural phenomena are described with a precision that feels unexpectedly modern. Fossils were noticed, Sediment was interpreted. The effects of water, wind, and heat were traced across landscapes with the patience of people who understood that change could be slow, cumulative, and nearly invisible in a single lifetime. What makes these writings remarkable is not that they solved geology before geology existed, but that they sensed a profound truth. The world beneath human history has a history of its own. That realization changes everything. Once the ground is understood as dynamic rather than fixed, time begins to stretch. A cliff becomes more than stone. It becomes duration made visible. A shell found far from the sea becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes evidence that the world has not always looked the way it does now. Ancient texts that move in this direction often feel ahead of their time because they challenge a deeply human instinct, the desire to treat the familiar world as permanent. And yet, these observations rarely stood alone. They were often embedded in broader reflections about order, creation, catastrophe, and continuity. The earth was not merely studied, it was contemplated. Its patterns invited both explanation and reverence. In that sense, these texts occupy a space modern readers sometimes forget, the place where empirical attention and philosophical wonder are not enemies, but companions. So perhaps the true sophistication of these writings lies not in whether they anticipated modern earth science line for line. It lies in their posture toward the world. They teach us that knowledge begins when we stop seeing the ground beneath us as background and start seeing it as evidence, layered, patient, and quietly capable of revising everything we thought we knew about time. Can language itself become a technology, something built not to express the world, but to shape how the world is understood? In the oldest centers of learning, writing was never a simple act of storage. It was selection, compression, design. A text could preserve a ritual, measure a field, train a physician, guide a navigator, or define the boundaries of a kingdom. But beyond all that, it could also impose order on experience. It could take the endless flow of life and turn it into categories, sequences, and systems that other minds could inherit. In that sense, some ancient writings were not merely records of knowledge. They were tools for manufacturing coherence. This becomes especially clear in texts that classify plants, animals, stars, substances, illnesses, or social duties with astonishing care. To modern readers, they may look incomplete, symbolic, or entangled with assumptions we no longer share. Yet beneath those differences lies something deeply familiar, the urge to build a framework large enough to hold complexity. These authors were not only asking what exists, they were asking how existence might be arranged so that memory, teaching, and judgment become possible. That is a profound technical act. A taxonomy, a glossary, a codified law, a standardized set of measures. These are inventions every bit as transformative as physical devices. They allow strangers to coordinate. They allow knowledge to survive beyond the lifespan of the knower. They reduce confusion not by eliminating mystery, but by giving communities a common language for facing it. Once that language exists, entire worlds of action become possible. And yet, such systems always carry a tension. To name something is to clarify it, but also to limit it. To classify the world is to make it legible, but sometimes at the cost of its wildness. Ancient texts understood this more than we may assume. Many move between precision and metaphor, law and poetry, fact and reverence, as if their authors sensed that reality could not be mastered by categories alone. So when we encounter writings that seem intellectually ahead of their time, we may be witnessing one of humanity's oldest powers, the ability to build invisible architectures of thought. Before machines transformed labor, language transformed perception. And perhaps that remains our most enduring invention, the effort to speak the world clearly enough that others can enter it, question it, and begin again. What if the most advanced knowledge in the ancient world was not hidden at all, but simply difficult to inherit? Imagine a workshop at dusk. Bronze tools rest beside ink-stained tablets. A teacher demonstrates a process that cannot be learned from observation alone. How to align an instrument, temper a material, judge a proportion, read a sign in the sky, or mix a compound at precisely the right moment. The student watches closely because some kinds of knowledge live only partly in words. The rest survives in timing, touch, repetition, and trust. This is the invisible world surrounding many ancient texts. A manuscript may describe a technique, but often it also assumes a community of practice. It expects readers to know the materials, the gestures, the context. That is why some documents seem startlingly sophisticated while remaining frustratingly incomplete. The page preserves the outline, but not always the lived skill that once made it fully legible. Knowledge in these cases is not merely information. It is apprenticeship. That distinction matters. We often treat the past as if its capabilities can be measured only by what survives in writing. But entire technologies can vanish when the chain of teaching breaks. An instrument without its maker's habits becomes an artifact. A formula without its tacit understanding becomes a puzzle. A text without its trained readers becomes mysterious, sometimes even mythic. What later generations call lost knowledge may in fact be ordinary expertise severed from the world that sustained it. And yet, there is something deeply human in that fragility. The most remarkable achievements have always depended on more than intelligence alone. They require continuity between people. Someone must care enough to teach. Someone else must care enough to learn. Across centuries, that fragile relay determines what a civilization keeps and what it forgets. It is not only libraries that preserve the future, it is relationships. So when ancient writings appear to hold technologies ahead of their time, perhaps the deeper story is not about vanished miracles. It is about transmission. How much of human understanding survives because it is written down, and how much disappears because no hand remained to guide another hand. In the end, knowledge may be less like a treasure buried in the past than a bridge, always needing to be crossed again before it is gone. Why are we so drawn to the possibility that the past knew more than it was supposed to know? Part of the answer lives in our own unease. Modern life is crowded with information, yet we often feel unmoored by it. We know more than any generation before us, and still we remain vulnerable to confusion, revision, and loss. So when we encounter an ancient text that seems to glimpse astronomy, medicine, mechanics, or matter in unexpectedly sophisticated ways, it touches something deeper than curiosity. It stirs the suspicion that history is not as secure or as linear as we once imagined. That suspicion can lead us in two directions. One path turns every mystery into a hidden certainty, every fragment into proof of forgotten mastery. The other path dismisses ancient insight too quickly, assuming that anything impressive must be an illusion of modern interpretation. Neither response is fully satisfying. Between them lies a more difficult, more generous approach, to see these texts as evidence of human intelligence working under very different conditions, producing knowledge that was sometimes symbolic, sometimes practical, sometimes astonishingly perceptive, and often all three at once. This is where the story becomes less about ancient technology and more about human self-understanding. We search old manuscripts not only to learn what earlier civilizations knew, but to ask what kind of beings we are. Are we creatures who progress steadily, leaving ignorance behind? Or are we participants in a longer, more fragile cycle, discovering, forgetting, preserving, and rediscovering what matters? The record of the past suggests the latter. It is not a smooth ascent. It is a conversation repeatedly interrupted. And maybe that is why these texts remain so alive. They remind us that intelligence is not confined to one era, one culture, or one accepted vocabulary of science. It appears wherever people observe carefully, imagine boldly, and care enough to record what they have seen. Some of those records survive in plain sight. Others survive in fragments, waiting for later generations to ask better questions. So the mystery is not merely in the manuscripts themselves. It is also in us, in our longing to believe that wisdom can outlast ruin, and that somewhere in the silence between lost pages, the human mind is still speaking. What remains after the mystery fades is often the most important thing of all. By this point, the pattern is unmistakable. Across ancient texts on mechanics, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, matter, and the living earth, we keep encountering the same quiet revelation. The past was never as simple as we were taught to believe. Its thinkers were not waiting in darkness for modernity to rescue them. They were watching, testing, comparing, preserving. Sometimes they reached conclusions that now feel startlingly close to later science. Sometimes they framed truth through symbolism, ritual, or philosophy rather than experiment. And often they did both at once. This should not lead us into fantasy. We do not honor ancient minds by turning them into magicians of lost perfection. We honor them more fully by recognizing the depth of their attention. Their achievement was not that they possessed every answer in advance. It was that they asked enduring questions with seriousness, patience, and imagination. They built systems from limited tools. They found pattern without certainty. They kept faith with inquiry, even when the world around them was unstable. There is something deeply moving in that continuity. The same species that once traced stars with naked eyes now sends instruments beyond the edge of the solar system. The same hands that copied medicinal recipes onto fragile pages belong, in a long and unbroken sense, to the people who map the genome and study the climate. The tools have changed. The longing has not. We still want to know what the world is made of, how the body fails, where time leaves its marks, and whether memory can survive destruction. Maybe that is the true thread connecting all of these texts. Not proof of impossible knowledge, but evidence of a permanent human condition. We are meaning-making creatures living inside partial understanding. We inherit fragments. We interpret them as best we can. We pass something forward, hoping it will remain legible to those who come after us. And that raises one final thought before this journey closes. If future generations were to know us only by our surviving fragments, what would they conclude about what we understood and what we were still struggling to become? In the end, perhaps the oldest texts do not reveal a vanished world of impossible knowledge. Perhaps they reveal something more intimate and more enduring, the shape of human curiosity itself. We began with the suspicion that some ancient writings seemed to know too much. Their pages carried designs that resembled later machines, observations that hinted at medicine, maps of the sky drawn with astonishing care, reflections on matter that sounded uncannily modern. For a moment, it was tempting to imagine history as a story interrupted, to picture great understandings rising early, then sinking beneath war, neglect, and time. In some measure, that is true. Knowledge has been lost, memory has been broken. Entire traditions of reading, making, and teaching have slipped beyond recovery. But that is not the whole story. What survives in these texts is not simply information. It is a record of attention. Someone looked closely. Someone compared appearances to patterns. Someone tried to turn experience into language durable enough to outlast a lifetime. That effort, repeated across centuries and civilizations, is one of humanity's deepest achievements. It is how a question becomes inheritance. And maybe that is why these documents still move us. They remind us that truth is rarely possessed all at once. It is approached in fragments, through speculation, error, revision, memory, and care. One generation names a mystery, another generation measures it, a third forgets. A fourth begins again. The path is uneven, but the impulse remains astonishingly constant. We are a species that writes into uncertainty, hoping the future will know what we were trying to say. So the final lesson is neither romantic nor cynical. The past was not magical. The present is not final. Between them stretches a long conversation in which every manuscript, every diagram, every copied line becomes a fragile act of faith. Faith that meaning can survive ruin. Faith that the unknown is worth approaching. Faith that somewhere ahead, another mind will open the page and continue. And perhaps that is the timeless question these ancient texts leave with us. Not whether earlier civilizations knew everything, but whether we will prove worthy of what they were trying, against all odds, to remember.